What's up, Wargamers? Welcome back to World of Wargaming. I'm Isaiah. Today, I invite you again to pull up a chair, a comfy one, grab a beverage and a tasty snack, and let me talk at you for a minute. Today, I'd like to talk at you about this game, Stargrave. Science fiction war games in the Ravaged Galaxy by one of my all-time favorite game authors, Mr. Joseph McCullough. So Stargrave is a miniatures agnostic science fiction head-to-head game. There is some content for the game that has been released that is solo play content, but we will talk about those supplements in a separate video. For today, we're only looking at this main rulebook, and as soon as I got this in the mail, first thing that I loved about it is the size of the book. It's not quite the super small rulebook size, but it's also not like a giant rulebook. So if this is a game that you're looking to be able to take places to your local, your LGS, or to a friend's house or wherever and play the game, the book is not going to be some massive tome that you have to carry around. The artwork in the book is really nice. So we've got a lot of artwork like this. Full color artwork, very different from the Rangers book, which is mostly the black and white kind of grim type style. This is very bright, very vibrant pieces of art, and lots of good shots like this where you're kind of getting to see models on the table, which, as I've mentioned before, is something that I always love to see in rule books because it provides me with inspiration not only for what to make my models look like, but for what to make my tables look like, because the table is that kind of other character in when we play games. Some people, you may not always think of it that way, but the table makes a big difference for your immersion fluffs and for your overall enjoyment of the game, or at least it does for me. So anytime I can get good, solid inspiration for tables and models, I'm a happy camper. Now, given the fairly small size of this book, it is pretty dense. It's 180-something pages packed into this size format. Now, another thing that I do enjoy is that it is a hardback book. I mean, if you're the kind of person who prefers softbacks over hardbacks, then I don't know that we have the same kind of energy. But it's a solid hardback book. Osprey Games publishing, putting it out into the world. Let's get into the meat of it. The game is recommended to be played on a 3x3, although if you're playing with more than 2 players, you could up the size of that board. All of your rolls in this game are made using a D20, much like Joe's other games, Rangers or Frostgrave. Now, my understanding is that this has got some pretty key differences between Rangers, which I'm very familiar with, and Stargrave. But my understanding is that if you played Frostgrave, the rules are almost the exact same, just kind of a reskin from high fantasy to science fiction. I have not played Frostgrave because I'm not as interested in it as I am Stargrave. So Stargrave is my starting point for the game. And it gives you a little bit of backstory about what's going on in the universe. The universe is there's been a great war, and now you've got all these random kind of independent crews that are plying through the void in search of riches, fame, wealth, a better life for themselves. Immediately to me, I pick up Firefly vibes. And I love that. Brown coat army for life, bro. Brown coats. That is not to say that Joe just kind of took Firefly and ran with it, but that's the feeling that I get from the way the universe and the worlds, because it's science fiction, is described. From there, we go into the first part of the book, which is building your crew. Now, as always, I'm not going to dig super deep into this part of the book because there will be a separate video for building a crew that we'll take a look at that when the time comes. But things that I will touch on is that you have a captain, who is your head numero uno. You have a first mate, who is your second in command. So in terms of translating that from Frostgrave, you would have your wizard and then your apprentice. Here you have a captain and a first mate. Your captain is more powerful than your first mate, but your first mate is definitely your second in command. And there are several different things. It can be a biomorph, a cyborg, a mystic, a robotics expert, a rogue, a psionicist, a techer, or a veteran. So you got some options for your backgrounds, and then you choose your powers, which are the equivalent of spells. They're force push, things like that. Now, when you're doing this, when you're designing your crew, one thing I would like to mention is if you're planning on playing the game as a head-to-head game instead of a solo game, there are different powers that are going to be of interest to you. Whereas if you're playing it as a solo game, there are going to be some of those powers that are completely useless to you in that mode because they deal with and affect what your opponent does. And of course, if you're playing solo, you don't have an opponent. So depending on which way you choose to play the game, that's something that you're going to need to consider when you're selecting your powers, because you don't want to go through all this and build your crew and have all these cool powers and then you never get to use them because you don't have an opponent. All captains start at level 15. All first mates start at level 0. Once you've got your captain and first mate sorted out, then you can choose the rest of your crew. You have 400 credits to spend, and you can recruit up to 8 soldiers, 4 of whom can be specialists, which means that your total crew size can be 10 models as long as you have the credits to pay for it. And of course, that credits, consider this when you're doing that, you have to pay the cost for the model. You also have to pay the cost for whatever equipment that model has. So think about that as you don't just immediately go for the best stuff, because you can end up with a whole bunch of good models and then not have enough money to equip them and outfit them. So keep that in mind as you build your crew. And as you're outfitting, there is a lot of equipment, both in terms of armor, general equipment, specialized equipment. There's a lot of things in there to choose from. Now, once you got your crew set up, that brings us to chapter 2, which is the rules. So we start with selecting table edges. Highest roll picks a table edge. Your opponent takes the opposite table edge. If you're playing on a very, very small board, like if you're playing on a 2x2 because that's the mats or the size of the room, whatever you had, then it recommends that instead of choosing a table side, choose a corner, and then your opponent's deploying in the diametrically opposed corner to the one that you choose as the winner of that roll. Again, those roll-offs are done with a D20. Once we have our board set up, it's time to place some loot tokens. So in Stargrave, there are 2 distinct types of loot tokens. There is physical loot, and there is data loot or information loot. When you place them, you roll a d20. On a 1 to 10, it's data loot. On an 11 to 20, it's physical loot. And the first one always goes in the absolute dead center of the table. Once that first one is down, players take it in turns to each place a data and a physical loot token. Now, there are a few guidelines on where you can place those. First off, it must be at least over halfway across the board from the place to place. So if I'm placing, it's got to be somewhere on my opponent's side of the board. It's got to be at least 6 inches from other loot tokens, and that includes vertical distance. So you could go like 6 inches straight up the building and place another token and then have a token down at the ground floor. Like many of Joe's games, the turn order operates in phases. So you have the initiative phase where you determine who's going to go first that round, and that's just based off who won the dice roll. You have the captain phase where your captain and any 2 crew members that started within 3 inches of him at the beginning of the phase can activate. Now, this is a big difference between Rangers and Stargrave. In Rangers, during your Ranger phase, you can activate companions anywhere on the board. Stargrave has the same mechanic as Frostgrave, where they had to have started the captain phase within 3 inches, which adds another layer of that movement complexity to the game, making sure that you actually keep somebody near your captain so that you have some other models to activate during that phase. After the captain phase, we go to the first mate phase, where it's the same thing. You can activate your first mate and then up to 3 soldiers. And I'm sorry, I apologize, on the captain phase, it's 3 soldiers, not 2. 3 soldiers. And then the first mate phase can be your first mate and up to 3 soldiers that are within 3 inches of him. And then we go to the soldier phase where the primary player can activate whoever they have left, as does the secondary player. And in each of those phases, you're going back and forth. So like player 1 activates their stuff for the captain phase, player 2 activates their stuff for the captain phase. Player 1 activates their stuff for the first mate phase, player 2 activates for the first mate phase. Player 1 activates for the soldier phase, player 2 activates for the soldier phase, which is a pretty common kind of turn order in a lot of Joe's games. So that's pretty easy to pick up on and follow. And then we come to the creature phase, where if there are any monsters, aliens, abominations, whatever on the table, they will do their thing. And then you go into the next round and it all starts over again. Now, point of order with the captain phase and the first mate phase. If you do not have a captain, you cannot activate models during the captain phase. If you no longer have a first mate, You cannot activate models during the first make phase. So there is potential there where if a captain or a first mate gets taken out early, your opponent is going to get some distinct advantage because they're going to be able to do stuff while you are stuck not being able to do stuff. So it does create some target priority situations for you and your opponent. Now, in each of those phases, when you're activating models, each model gets two things. Usually one of those things will be a move. So you can move and then shoot or fight or use a power or a spell, or not a spell, a power or an item or whatever. Whatever that you want to do there, you can. But you get two things. And again, it reminds us that for the captain and first mate phase, it is the models that started the phase within 3, not models that were within 3 after the captain moves. And to my knowledge, I don't think you have to activate the captain first in the captain phase. I think you can do the other 2 guys and then the captain if you so choose. Same with the first mate. And then we have special activation in the form of group activation, where you can activate your captain plus any other models that you could activate in that phase that are legal to activate to where they all go at the same time. So you're doing all your guys, they all have to take a move for their first action, and then, which is a good thing for maybe like if you're trying to set up some good melee where you've got good support in the fight. Instead of moving a guy in, swing in, and then not have the support, you can move everybody in, create your support, gang up on them, and then just beat them down into a bloody pulp and just stomp the mess out of them. Occasionally, as you venture through the ravaged wasteland of the far future, you may be called upon to make stat rolls, which are pretty basic. You roll your d20, add your appropriate stat to it, and you're trying to reach the target number, for example, 16 or whatever. If you're trying to make a will roll, 10, 16, you roll your d20, add your will stat, hope that you make the target number, and then see accordingly. A 20 is always a success. A 1 is always a failure. You cannot have a support bonus or a modifier that is greater than 10. It caps out at 10 for whatever modifiers you may be dealing with. We then come to movement. There is no facing in the game, so they can see a full 360 around them. When you move, your first movement is your base movement. If your second movement, you can move up to half. Now, in this game, it specifically says to use the fraction. So like if your movement is 5, you move your 5, and then you want to move again, you would move half to give you a total movement of 7.5 inches. 5 for the first one, 2.5 for the second. And then if you somehow manage to come up with a third action, you could move again if you really, really, really wanted to. Obstructions work pretty standard, par for the course. It's double movement, so if you're trying to climb up something that's 3 inches, it's going to take you 6 inches of movement to get up it. Rough ground is the same. Every movement through it costs 2 for every 1. Movement into combat is when you move into base to base. With Joe's games, it's usually base to base. And while you are in combat, the only actions that you can take are to fight or to use a power. You may not move, shoot, reload, or use gear. So that's pretty common in Joe's games, that once you're stuck in until something happens. Now, usually, if you win the combat, you usually will get the option to step away, and we'll talk about that when we get to the combat section. Forcing combat works the same way. It's the forcing combat rule is there to prevent you from just walking past monsters or mobs that are there to guard something. So if you move within an inch, whatever you moved within an inch of has the choice to force combat, which means they can snap that inch into you and lock you into combat. As a defender or as a player, you do not have to force combat. It's an option, and sometimes it behooves you to not force it. Sometimes it behooves you to force it. So that's another layer of strategy piled onto the game, which is good. We like things that add to the strategic value of the game without adding lots and lots of complicated rules. That's a good thing. And as always in Joe's games, you have the option to leave the table voluntarily. If you choose to just walk off, that's fine. It doesn't count as a death or points for your opponent, anything like that. They just fled the battlefield. Now, you also have something in this game that is new to me, which is the run for it concept. So when a model activates before doing anything else, you can declare that you will run for it, which gives you a 3-inch movement in any direction as long as it can't take you into contact or into combat with an enemy, but 3 inches, and then your activation ends, which might not sound that great, but if you're in a position where that model has been reduced to less than 3 inches of total movement, either through carrying stuff or toxins or whatever, it gives you an opportunity to still be able to get them a little bit further across the board than they would have naturally been able to do. which is nice because there are situations where not being able to move can be very, very frustrating. So it gives you an out for that, at least a small out, and a small out is better than no out. So then we come to jumping, which if it's a distance of an inch, you don't have to have any previous movement. Anything bigger than an inch, you have to get a bit of a running start. The distance jumped does not count towards your movement, but it also cannot exceed your movement. So for example, let's say you have a move of 5. You move 2.5 inches and you jump 2.5 inches. Then you can still move that other 2.5 inches that you would have had left over from your movement. And you can calculate in all of your movement. Like when you're calculating this, you can calculate it as if you were going to do a double move action. So you can take into account that full length of movement that you would have had. Now, if you miss your jump and you fall, bad stuff can happen. So when you fall, if you fall less than 3 inches, no big deal. Nothing's really going to happen to you. If you fall more than 3 inches, however, you're going to potentially take some damage. So you would take a point of damage equal to the number of inches that you fell, multiplied by 1.5, and rounded down. So for example, if you fell 5 inches, you would take 7 damage. Yeah, falling can be pretty rough. You can choose to fall voluntarily, to just kind of jump down from the surface that you're on, and you would damage, as long as your movement is as long as you have enough movement to get the distance you're jumping down or falling down, not a problem. You can still take fall damage if you're trying to jump down or fall down from something that is too high. And then lastly, if you are within an inch and you get pushed back an inch, you automatically fall, either through a power or weapon or something like that. Which next brings us to swimming, which as in Rangers, swimming is deadly. I hope to, as much as possible, keep myself out of deep water. It's the same as in Rangers. You got that will roll with a target number of 5, taking into account some of the modifiers table, such as carrying physical loot, armor, heavier combat armor, or being a robot. Water counts, or deep water counts as rough ground for purposes of movement, so it can take you a while to potentially get out of it. Water scares me to death in Joe's games. Ever since I had a good friend die, drowned to death, trying to swim across the swamp in an episode of Rangers, it's terrifying. It's an absolutely terrifying thing. Because you would think, whatever, it's just a 5, I can make that, but then you roll 2s and 1s all the time, and you just end up butchering everybody because you can't make that roll. So as much as possible, I try to avoid water in these games. Which brings us full steam ahead into combat. So combat works the way it does in many of others Joe's games. Both models roll a d20, add applicable modifiers, and whoever has the higher score gets to hit, which means that when you're in melee, yes, you have a chance to hit your opponent, but they also have the chance to hit you back, which can, at times, depending on health levels and equipment and things like that, really, really, really make you consider whether or not rushing headlong into melee is the right choice. Also, let's just take a second here and appreciate this piece of art with this Robo Doggo on it. I bet he's just the best good robot boy. When you win a fight, as I mentioned earlier, and this can be particularly useful if you happen to be fighting on a rooftop somewhere, is that if you win, you have 3 options. You can choose to stay in combat, you can choose to step back an inch, or you can choose to push your opponent an inch, potentially pushing them off of a building to fall to, hopefully, their demise. Once you figured out who won that combat, as far as who's going to hit, your next step is to figure out your damage, which is you take your total, you subtract their armor, and anything that is left over is the damage dealt. Your armor maxes out at 14. You cannot have an armor value higher than 14. Anything that would take you higher than 14, it stops, caps out, and stays at a 14. However, if you have higher than a 14, and you have a power or something happens to where it negatively affects your armor, my understanding is that you would take that off. So if you had 18 total, but you cap at 14, and you get something that reduces your armor by 4, you're still going to have a 14, is my understanding. I could be wrong there, but that's my understanding of it. If you're in melee, we have support like we do in other games. You get +2 for every supporting model, and enemy models cancel each other out. So if it's you and 2 bad guys, the 2 bad guys would have +2 support. If it's 2 good guys, 2 bad guys, nobody gets support. And it keeps canceling each other out like that up to a maximum of 10, a bonus of plus 10 that you can get from support, which is different than Rangers. In Rangers, there is no cap. You can just go all the way up if you really wanted to. Shooting works pretty much the same way as combat, only they don't get to fire back at you, and when you shoot at them, they add their fight stat, and that's what you're checking against to see whether or not you hit, and then ultimately do damage. If you are in melee in this game, you cannot shoot. But if you use a power that generates a shooting attack, and this is separate, this is not necessarily on the same line, this is just the next point of conversation, is that if you use a power that generates a shooting attack, you do not apply your shoot stat, you just have a default bonus that's listed in the power. So that's for, you have to check your powers on that. Now when you shoot, as with many games, there are modifiers. You have modifiers for intervening terrain, a hasty shot, which is moving before you shoot, clearing a jam, light cover, stun, heavy cover, large target. And these things, if I'm not mistaken, these add to the target's roll, not to your roll. To the target's fight dice roll. Yes, and that's something, I don't know why, but in Joe's game that just always throws me for a loop with the shooting modifiers, is that I always want to apply them as minuses to my roll instead of as pluses to the modification of the target roll. It just throws me for a loop. I don't know why it does. It probably shouldn't, as much as I've played like Rangers. It really shouldn't, but it still throws me for a loop every once in a while. So that's something to definitely keep an eye on as you play. Now, one thing that this game does allow, which is not allowed in Rangers, is that you can, if you think it's the right decision, you can shoot into a combat that is ongoing. However, you can't select the target. You target the combat, and then if you hit, you randomize to roll. You roll randomly and randomize who you're going to hit in that combat. So you got a chance of hitting their guy, but you also have a chance of hitting your guy. So it's a risk to reward conundrum for you to determine for yourself as the gamer, person at the table. Another thing that this game has that I absolutely love is it has templates. So there's a flamethrower template, which I'm not certain, but I think, like, he tells you you can just print it out from the back of the book. These are the blast template. These are the templates. They're roughly the same size as the old school GW templates. So if you have those templates still laying around, I'm sure that they will work just fine. With these, instead of checking for range and line of sight, you just lay your template down, and any model that it touches is going to get hit by that attack. But it is a separate shooting attack for each thing under the template. So keep that in mind. You're not just rolling once and applying it to everything the template touches. You roll individually for each of them. We also have allowances in here for chucking grenades at people. Now, when you chuck a grenade, you pick a point on the map to throw it at. That's within your range. You does not have to be in your line of sight, which makes sense because you can absolutely chuck a grenade over a wall without really seeing what's going to be there. And then they use the blast templates, and it's a target number 12 to see if it gets where you want it to go. And then at the bottom of that page, there are some modifiers for grenade attacks. Every once in a while, you will be called on to randomize something. I normally randomize things with a D10, but it's the same thing doing it with a D20 because each face of the D20 is a triangle, so you just use the top side of that triangle to determine your motion. Now, if you actually have a scattered dice laying around, you're welcome to use that because it doesn't say that you have to do it this way. It just says that this is the way that he has, because I'm sure that he recommends the D20 method because you've already got D20s out and on the table for playing the game anyways, so it's one less thing that you got to carry with you or hunt down or whatever. So when we come and we discuss our critical hits, so a 20 is a critical hit. In a melee, if both parties roll a 20, then they both do +5 bonus damage and hit each other. A crit's always a success. So if you're melee, it's an automatic hit and an extra 5 to the damage roll. If it's a shooting attack, it works the same way for the shooter. However, even if the shooter rolls a 20, if the defender also rolls a 20, the defender nat 20 cancels out the shooter nat 20, and the shot misses. On the other side of that, we have weapon jams. So if a shooting attack rolls a 1, the weapon jams, and you have to spend an action to clear that jam before you're going to be able to shoot that weapon again, which I like. I think that's a fun, interesting way. Now, in some games like Bolt Action, for example, I absolutely hate the concept of turret jam. It's a pain in the tail. I don't deal with it. But in this, I like it because it gives you a consequence for rolling that one, but not a consequence that is so obscene that it makes the game not fun, and also not so weak that it makes it pointless to play and pay attention to. If a model receives 4 or more damage in a single shooting attack, they are stunned, which means they drop to the ground and they're trying to maximize their use of cover. They're trying to hide. Because of that, they have a +2 bonus to fight rolls for any other shooting attacks that would come at them. And the next time they activate, you remove the stun marker, stand them up, and they get 1 activation because you figure it takes 1 action to stand up and shake the stun, and then you have an action remaining. If another figure moves into combat with a figure that is stunned, you immediately remove the token or stand up the figure, and the figure is no longer stunned, but it has a -2 to the fight roll. So they have a negative modifier to their fight roll for coming out of the daze. After stunned, we have the wounded status effect, which is that if you are at 4 health or less, you are wounded, which means you have 1 action and you are -2 to all of your dice rolls. Wounded never applies to robots, and it doesn't apply to your starting health. So if you started a game at 4 health or less, you would not start the game wounded, but as soon as you lost a point of health, you would become wounded. And then we touch on toxins. Toxins work the exact same way they do in Rangers. If you are attacked or damaged by something that has the toxic trait, then you are reduced to 1 base activation. Then we come to powers. Okay, so with powers, your first mate and your captain are the only 2 people on your team that have access to them. They can use them as an action at any time, even if they're in combat. There is no restriction on the number of times a power can be used in a game. So it's not like you use it once and then you can't use it for the rest of the game. You can use the same power multiple times. The success or failure on it is determined by the target number, which is listed on the power itself. Now, once you roll, you have an option there to exert yourself. So when you exert, you can exchange health for dice modification on a 1-to-1 basis. So if you failed your power roll, your activation roll by 3, you could trade 3 life to bring that up to a successful power activation. Beyond exertion, we have strain. Now, some powers are more taxing on the user than others. So if they have a strain that is greater than 0, once you try to cast the spell, you immediately take damage equal to that strain number. So it may be a very, very powerful spell, but you may want to think twice about using it super often, as it will damage you along the way. Now, the power move is when you activate to use a power, either before you use the power or after, you get a free 3-inch movement in any direction. And then if you would like to, you can still take a regular move action after that. If a power has an ongoing effect and it doesn't list when it stops, then it stays in effect for the duration of the game. Even if the person who used the power and put the power on them leaves the game or is killed, that power is still in effect until the end of the game. Now, in combat with powers, if you're using a power that generates a shooting attack and you are not in the combat, then it works the exact same way as it would if you were shooting into a combat. However, if you are in that combat, your power will immediately and always target whoever you intended to target. So then we come into how we interact with our loot tokens. So regardless of whether it is physical or data, it requires a will check on a target number of 14 to unlock it, either to unlock the box or to hack the terminal, as it were. Now, physical loot can be picked up as a free action. Data loot, however, requires an action to download that data into your device, Pip-Boy, deck, whatever it is that you have that you're using to interact with that piece of technology. Data loot incurs no penalty for carrying it. Physical loot leaves you encumbered. So it halves your movement, and it gives you -1 to shoot and -1 to fight. Physical loot can be dropped as an action. Yep, and it can, that action of dropping the loot, you can do that instead of moving if you so choose. Loot tokens never block line of sight, they never provide cover, and they never impede movement until you pick them up and it halves your movement. And then lastly in this section, we have our enemy AI for our uncontrolled, our monsters that are on the table. And like most of Joe's AIs, it is very, very simple and straightforward. Step one is the creature in combat. If yes, then it'll use its action to fight. If it wins, it will always choose to stay in combat. If no, then proceed to step two. Is there a crew member in line of sight? If yes, and it's armed with a missile weapon, it'll take a shot and take no second action. If it has no missile weapon, it will move as far as it can towards the closest crew member, and if it gets into combat to a point where it can swing on that, it will fight. If no, then we proceed to step three, which is a target point or a random movement. So it will either make a random movement, or if there is a target point in the scenario, it will move towards the target point. For the ending of the game, it's most usually going to be once the last loot token is moved off the table, or if only one player has figures left, then it's over. And in that case, the player with the figures remaining on the table secures all the loot tokens that are currently being carried by members of their crew. Furthermore, they can roll a dice and have a chance at picking up the unclaimed loot tokens on a roll of 15 plus. And then we come into the campaign section. There are 5 steps to the post-game section, which are going to sound pretty familiar if you played other games by Joe, or if you've just played a lot of narrative type war games. These steps usually stay pretty consistent. So step 1 is check for injury or death. Step 2 is use out-of-game powers. There are some powers that only work in the post-game phase. Calculate your experience and levels, roll for your loot, and then spend your loot. And that's pretty straightforward. You just move through it. As in other games, there's all kinds of different, crushed arms, lost fingers, psychological damage. Your captain and your first mate, I think, get XP. I'm not sure about the other guys in the crew. So while XP is not specifically tied to a certain character, it is only your captain and your first mate that level up and gain bonuses by spending said XP. Then we come to the loot, where there's a D20 table that we roll on, one for data loot, one for physical loot. And then we've got some advanced weapons, things that we can buy. So we've got advanced weapons as well as advanced technology that we have access to purchase. Other things you can spend your loot on are new soldiers, a new captain if your captain died, or a new first mate if your first mate died. You can sell items, you can buy items, you can improve your ship. That's a part that I think is really, really interesting, is being able to add upgrades onto your ship that will help give you bonuses in the game. So things like advanced medical suites, a robotics workshop, extra quarters, things like that help beef out that immersion of being on this ship and going through this ravaged galaxy. Next, we come to the list of all the different powers, of which there are quite a few. All of this right here is powers. It's from page 105 to page 118, so quite a few powers. And then we come to scenarios, of which in the core book there are 10 different scenarios and a chart that you can roll on to determine which of those scenarios you will be engaging in. And all of this is your scenario section. Now, if you play through all of these and you need some more, there is a fair amount of supplement content out there for this game. Some of it is meant to be used in the head-to-head mode. Some of it is meant to be solo or co-op. So you do have some options there about where to go once you've played through everything in this book. Now, in each of those scenarios, there are some tables for the setting, whether it's a jungle planet or a starport or anything like that. You can also use those to come up and cook up your own scenarios and things that you're going to be doing. It gives you some charts for some random encounters as well as for some unwanted attention, which are randomizing things that show up on the board for you to deal with. And then we come into our bestiary, which is all of our mobs. Now, I do not know if there exists for this game a set of cards with all the mobs like there is for Rangers. It's something that I'm going to be looking into once I'm fully ready to get this onto the table. But there's a lot of stuff, a lot of different monsters that you could potentially have. And then lastly, we come to attributes, which are things like amphibious, aquatic, flying, never stunned. The keywords and special phrases that things can have, which I'm glad that this is here, because in some of Joe's other books, it uses keywords, but it never really gives you an explanation of the keywords, especially in Rangers. It's just kind of a when the thing has that keyword, you do it. So I'm glad that there's an actual list of those keywords. Next up, we come to the reference section of the book. And as we all know, I love a reference. So the first thing it gives us there is, of course, the crew sheet for playing the game. But then it gives us power cards. So it gives us cards for all the power so that we can quickly and easily access what our crew has. And then we come to the template cutouts. Now, I'm almost certain that this is available as just a PDF somewhere that you can download. Because if you bought a hard copy book, you don't want to be cutting pages out of the book, especially if they're double-sided, because it just doesn't line up that well. And then we have our actual legit quick reference, where it gives us our turn order, what our actions are, how group activation works, how movement works, how combat works. All the information that we need to play the game once we have everything set up is tucked in these last 4 or 5 pages. Thank you. Thank you, Joe, for doing that for me, or for us. I wish that Rangers had this same kind of quick reference in the back of it, just because it's useful. It's helpful information. It speeds up the gameplay and allows us to focus on what we're at the table to do, which is move toy soldiers and make pew-pew sounds, not flip through pages in a book. So the core book for this game clocks in between like $30 and $40, depending on where you buy it from. I want to say I got mine from Target, if I'm not mistaken, because I had a Target gift card online, and they had a vendor that was selling it third party through them. So very reasonably priced, especially for the amount of content that the book has in it. Not to mention the fact that there is plenty of supplement content. I currently have the Hope Eternal supplement, which is the full-blown solo campaign. And there was also a free supplement that was put out by Joe and Osprey, which is another kind of solo co-op thing where you're doing bounty hunt targets and you're hunting down various nefarious folks across the ravaged galaxy. I haven't played that one yet. It also looks like a lot of fun, and it's a free piece of content. As everybody knows, we like free stuff. We like free stuff. The game does, however, have a lot of models. There are a lot of things that are needed, especially once you talk about monsters and terrain and stuff like that. Now, obviously, if you're comfortable using standees or proxies, you are free to do that. As a miniatures agnostic game, no one's going to come to your house kicking your door and say, hey, you're playing the game wrong. That's not going to happen. But if you are like me, I view it as an opportunity to broaden my collection, because the more models and things like that I add to my collection, the easier it is for me to then later jump into other games, because I already have suitable models in the case. So for me, I look at this the same way as I did Rangers. It's an excellent opportunity to broaden the depth of my collection. It also gives me an excuse to maybe go buy some of those really cool sci-fi models that I've seen in the blister packs from Reaper or whoever, that I was like, man, that's freaking cool, but what am I going to use it for? Well, there you go. End of the day, if you like sci-fi, if you already have a deep collection of sci-fi models, or like me, if you're looking to grow your collection of sci-fi models, Stargrave is a great way to do that while having a fun narrative adventure along the way. If you're already familiar with Joe's games, and you already know that this is probably going to be the heat. If you're not familiar with Joe's games, well, hopefully after sitting through this and listening to me ramble for a while, you've become a little bit more familiar, and hopefully you're a little bit excited to get out there and try one of the many, many, many amazing games that Mr. McCullough has created. Thank you so much for stopping by, letting me talk at you for a little bit about Stargrave, science fiction war games in the ravaged galaxy. I hope you have an absolutely amazing rest of your day. And as always, I'd like to say a big, huge, from the bottom of my heart, thank you to our patrons who support us and pledge to us over on Patreon. You guys are the absolute best. If you enjoyed the content you saw here today, and that's something that you would like to consider doing to help out the channel, go over there, check out the link in the description, check out the Patreon. There's a lot of cool stuff over there, including access to our Discord server, talk to me, hang out with me, talk about our work, what we got going on in the hobby. some shout outs, all kinds of cool stuff. Check it out if that's something that you think you would be into. And regardless of whether or not you do that, I want you to know that I am incredibly grateful that you decided to stop by and spend part of your day with me today, rolling dice and pushing toy soldiers around. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day. And as always, may the dice be ever in your